Welcome everybody to the Center for Iranian Diaspora Studies and the Center Doc Film Institute at San Francisco State. This event is being co-hosted by the Comparative Literature and Middle East and, South Asian Studies at UC Davis. And we're proud to present today's conversation about the film Nasrin, which was secretly filmed in Iran and presents an immersive portrait of the respected human rights activist and current political prisoner Nasrin Sotoudeh, and the background around her life story as well. And we have today with us the two filmmakers, Marcia Ross and Jeff Kaufman, as well as the associate producer, Amir Soltani. I'm going to briefly introduce them, and then we will start conversing with our filmmakers. If you haven't seen the film, if you registered for this event, you have until 10 o'clock tonight. So we hope you get a chance to see it, and it's circulating widely. There are many presentations, and there is a website which we would like to invite you to look at. It's on the chat. Okay, nasrinfilm.com, www.nasrinfilm.com. So to learn more about screenings and more about the film and the filmmakers, we invite you to do that. In the meantime, I want to introduce the panelists for today. I'll start with Jeff Kaufman, who's one of the filmmakers. He's the director, writer, producer, along with his wife, Marcia Ross. He's produced and directed and wrote the documentaries Every Act of Life, which premiered at Tribeca, The State of Marriage, Father Joseph, The Savoy King, Chick Webb and Music That Changed America, Brush with Life, The Art of Being, Edward Bieberman, and Education Under Fire, plus several short films for Amnesty International. He also edited and designed a book based on the film Every Act of Life and has contributed cartoons to the New Yorker and illustrations to the Los Angeles Times and the New York Times. And he's also written and illustrated several children's books. Marcia Ross produced the documentaries Every Act of Life, The State of Marriage, Father Joseph, and The Savoy King. She's also had a 3-decade-long career as an independent casting director and casting executive, serving for 16 years as executive vice president for casting at Walt Disney Motion Pictures, and 5 years as vice president for casting and talent development at Warner Brothers TV. Some of her film and television credits include Clueless, Cujo, 30-something, Murder in Mississippi, 10 Things I Hate About You, The Princess Diaries, Romy, and Michelle's High School Reunion. She's received Career Achievement Awards from the Casting Society of America and the Hollywood Film Festival. So welcome to you both. And then Amir Soltani, who's a dear friend, is an Iranian-American writer, filmmaker, and human rights activist. His graphic novel on protest and dissent in Iran, Zara's Paradise, which I highly recommend, was co-created with Khalil Bendib, and was nominated for 2 Eisner Awards. So wonderful book, and I think it reflects Amir's long and very committed career as a human rights activist. He's also a filmmaker. He wrote, directed, and produced Dogtown Redemption. And you can also probably see that, Amir, if you want to put that in the chat. This is an all-star cast of creators and lovers of human rights. So I'm very pleased to have you today, along with my co-host, Soumyaa Behrens, who's the director of the Doc Film Institute here at San Francisco State. She teaches in the cinema program, and she's a filmmaker in her own right and produced and directed several films, including one that we're working on together called The Dawn Is Too Far, about Iranian Americans in the San Francisco Bay Area. Today we're engaged in conversation about the film Nasrin, which features the human rights activist Nasrin Sotoudeh. And I thought maybe we'd start by asking our 2 filmmakers a little bit about how they got involved in this project and a little bit about the trajectory of the film, because it is very unique in that they didn't film it in Iran themselves, but were basically producing the film from footage that was gathered over, I gather, quite a long period of time. And I wonder if you could say a little bit about that process as well as how you got involved with it.
I'll start the first part. Okay, so Jeff had made a film, Education Under Fire, before we met. It's about the persecution of the Baha'i faith in Iran. And Nasrin was one of the people that he came across while making that film, because she, as a Muslim woman, was defending and helping her Baha'i clients and friends and neighbors. And this was very inspirational, actually, to both of us, this idea of, neighbors helping neighbors, even at great risk to themselves, and of separate, religions or faiths. So we were finishing up our film, Every Act of Life, it's about Broadway and the American playwright and pioneer in gay rights, Terrence McNally. And, Nasrin's name was quite a bit in the news. And we thought, this would be a really interesting, bigger story to tell. She's such a pivotal character right now in both Iranian politics and life, and also on the larger stage. And we also felt that, she represented so much as far as the kind of work that she does, the kind of human being that she is. And we wanted her story to be told, because we were also concerned that if her story wasn't told, that it might just go away. I think so often people's stories disappear. History gets rewritten, and it's told through various different points of view. And, we wanted to make sure that she was able to have her story told as she wished it to be told. And so we got introduced to her, and we started talking to Nasrin and asked her if she'd be interested in having this film made. And she said yes. We were, of course, very concerned about her safety making the film, and Jeff's going to talk about that in more depth about, how we felt the need to protect her. And we were very careful about that, because we asked her many, many times, are you sure? Are you sure? We'll stop at any time, because, it could have been very dangerous for her to be doing this film, but she really wanted it. And as you know, she's in prison now. She was arrested while we were making the film, not because of the film, but because of the work that she was doing, for those of you who've seen the film. And we're very glad that, she got to tell her story while she could.
Yeah, it's just, there's so many barriers in life now. And when we started making this film, it was a time when a certain group of politicians were really trying to dust up anti-Islamic fervor and demonization of Iran, not for any reason, but to build their own power base. And I found that just really distressing. But there's all these other barriers in life too. It's so hard to get to know your neighbors down the street in Los Angeles, let alone someone far away. And if you just think about this process of getting to know and becoming, I think, close friends with Reza and Nasrin, 7,500 miles away, it's just it's a little miracle. There are a lot of things that are discouraging in life, and I think one of the miracles of our life has been this opportunity to get to know them, and through them so many others. So as Marcia said, we reached out to them and asked if we could do this film, and whenever you're filmmakers too, so there's always this process of checking each other out and proving that what you're worth. But we developed a way to film with Nasrin and to get the footage out of Iran, which was sometimes enormously complicated, with large gaps between where it started and where it ended up. We just got this remarkable footage, and it was a give and take. I'd sometimes say, wouldn't it be great if we could do this? Or, oh, please, 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 I hope we can film with Jafar Panahi. And other times there'd be these surprises, or we'd get one piece and we'd urge, something else. But over time, because, Nasrin she's not just, I remember I once knew this person and they said, oh, I only read about my subject. I don't know anything else in the world. And one of the things I love about Nasrin is that she's so interested in politics, in arts, in culture, painting and music and theater. And we really wanted to capture that element of Iran. One of, I think, our driving purposes was to show a sense of Iran that you don't normally see in the West. the richness of the culture and the people. So, but that's Nasrin, and she took us all those places. And there's remarkable filmmakers who had to be anonymous throughout the entire process. We never fundraised publicly. We didn't do any online outreach. We had to keep the whole thing, under our vest while we were making the film and editing the film. But it just became this wonderful team. And then that team got wider, including Amir Soltani. And then I just have to say that with Nasrin's arrest, as Marcia mentioned, it became not just a film, but a campaign. And because Nasrin always wanted this film to be about others. Yes, it's a film about Nasrin, and yes, it's a campaign to release Nasrin. But but it's really a campaign on behalf of political prisoners in Iran and really political prisoners all around the world. And we hope people take away that inspiration. So it doesn't just stay with Nasrin, but it grows inside and continues, for years to come for others like her.
Can I just say, as Jeff was saying, we really couldn't go to Iran for a lot of reasons. I mean, one, Jeff had made a number of films previously about it, and I'm sure we would have been instantly arrested. But also bringing an American crew or 2 Americans over there, we wouldn't have been able to really capture the intimacy of her life at work and on the streets and all the places that you see. It would not have been possible. And having the filmmakers follow her there, that allowed us to capture something we couldn't have gotten any other way. Jeff had done this before, this way of working when he did Education Under Fire, so he knew how to communicate with people and from a filmmaking, and we'll talk more about that later, but to communicate what we were looking for, what we needed. And then also we traveled around the world and we interviewed people ourselves, Iranian exiles who, and other interesting people who, were not, so we didn't have to go to Iran.
I just wanted to build on some of the things that you mentioned here, because what really, one of the things that really interests me about your film is how collaborative it is. And how without that sort of collaboration, it really wouldn't have been possible in the way that it was made. And I'm very much into this idea of being an accomplice, being in cahoots as a filmmaker with the people that you're working with. And it sounds like, the relationships that you've developed have put you in a similar position. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what it means to be an accomplice to Nasrin's efforts.
Sure. Well, there's this thing in filmmaking called the possessory credit, a film by so-and-so. I always think that's the most ridiculous thing. I don't care if you're on the top of the pyramid of Hollywood, no one makes a film by themselves unless they make the film by themselves. But yeah, I mean, it's strange. At the beginning of this process, I think we had a very strong vision of what we hoped the film would be. And oftentimes, whether you're preparing for a shoot or preparing for a whole film, you do all the preparation and then you kind of put it aside and you let the process take you someplace, but it won't take you to a good place unless you've done the preparation in the first place. But miraculously, or something else, there's all these pieces we could never have expected. But I think what the film became as far as its message and its community spirit was really what we hoped for at the beginning. But again, it's all collaboration, and that's just part of the delight. We have a fabulous editor we work with, a wonderful composer, Lynn Ahrens and Stephen Flaherty, who are amazing songwriters. We got to know them in our Terrence McNally film, wrote this end credit song. It's also a music video that you can see, which is inspired by Nasrin's own letters to her children in prison. And the amazing Angelique Kidjo, who's a global figure, a Grammy winner, sang this song. And then, just one little other dot in that line of miracles is that when Nasrin finally came out of prison on her medical leave, she finally had a chance to watch the film for the first time. She finally had a chance to watch the music video about 8 times. And she's had a chance to communicate, with Angelique. And so just that cross back and forth is what filmmaking is about. But, without getting too ponderous, it's also what the best of life can be about.
The other thing too, I think for us was, we don't speak Farsi. So this was also part of the adventure. I mean, Jeff touched upon this earlier, where we would receive footage and we didn't know what she was saying. So Jeff would be kind of logging the footage and the shots. And then we had some wonderful translators who we worked with, who then would send us the translations. And it wasn't only till later that we would know actually what they were talking about in the film, which of course that also in the editing process, we worked very close. Our editor also worked very closely with one of our translators. But I found, and I spoke about this before, that was so interesting for me as we were going through the editing process, how much I began to realize that Nasrin was making sure she was saying to whoever was listening everything she wanted to get out. I know she had to believe she would get arrested again at some point. She didn't know when, she wasn't trying to get arrested, but the nature of her work and the choices that she made could ultimately lead to being arrested again. And so the time was very precious so that the word was out there. And that really became increasingly clear as we edited the film.
Yeah. Can I add one more thing if we're not taking too much time, which is that, we'd get the footage and I log every single second, of every single shot. And you'd come across a moment and you go, oh my goodness, who's that face? What's that person saying? And I remember, I can see his face now. I can remember Nasrin's having this conversation with this gentleman who's elderly and has a face that's very serious and then lights up and she's smiling and she's serious. And I said, I have to know who this person is. And it turns out when we tell the story towards the end about the Girls of Revolution Street, which is this important social movement, and this young woman, Nargis Hosseini, who was arrested for taking off her hijab, this gentleman who I just couldn't stop looking at, he's this businessman and human rights activist who was the person who raised the bail for Nargis. Nasrin needed to go to someone. She said, you always help us. Can you help us? And he says, whatever you need. And he gives her the money to get Nargis out of prison. And I don't, again, it's just so amazing to have that kind of connection. But also, there's this person, they signed a release. He knows that he could be in trouble for being in the film. The courage and the bravery and the belief in civil society, it's just so inspiring.
That's a good segue into bringing Amir into this conversation, where Amir, I know your work as a human rights activist is longstanding, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your own relationship to this story, but also, one of the risks, of course, about doing a story like this is there's a lot of bad press about Iran, and to some degree, you've circumvented the repeat cycle of, oh, it's a terrible place by showing this remarkable story and this remarkable individual and the world around her. But I wonder, Amir, if you could talk a little bit about how hard it is or how challenging it is to do human rights work around Iran, but also around not just participating in the same narrative about Iranian people that is so prevalent in our own media.
Thank you, Persis. Hello, Soumyaa, Shahryar, Jeff, and Marcia. It's such a pleasure to be with all of you. Persis, I've seen what Persis has done for Iranian Persian culture in America, so it's nice that also is part of our voice, and I think of you as part of the human rights world that I'm in, Persis. I'll share with you the most beautiful moment of my life, which I consider to be a gift from Jeff and Marcia, but also my friends at Penn, who've also been very active in terms of pursuing Nasrin. And that was a film, a little short clip that Jeff sent me of the day that Nasrin walked out of prison, standing outside Qarchak prison with a sign that says, women's prison, in this god-awful place, and just seeing her son hug her. I mean, just that. So as a human rights activist, I was 12 when the revolution happened and I started seeing people vanish in our prisons. Everything I've tried to do ever since then has been to open up these prisons, open up their gates, and have the people that we care and love come out of them. So for me, as a human rights activist, when I have an opportunity to support a film like Nasrin, it's a miracle. It comes back to it really is a miracle. I witnessed a miracle. Nasrin stepped out of prison. This is a woman who's sentenced to 38 years in prison, 38 and a half years in prison, 148 lashes. And we've just been banging on our drums, you know, through PEN, through all these other organizations that have really, I mean, this is really a global movement to release her. And the film's been the drum, you know, where Jeff shows the film and we go the drumming behind it and saying, you know, free Nasrin. And you know, just yesterday, or I think it was yesterday, you know, an extremely important Saudi activist, Lujain Al-Halul was, I hope I pronounce her name, was released. So I think the most important thing that I have to share with people is that in fact, human rights activism works and raising our voices works. I mean, Nelson Mandela would always say when he was in prison, you know, nothing would give him more courage than knowing that people outside the prison cared for him and for the cause that he was in prison for. And I think that, again, Jeff and Marcia have given the most extraordinary gift to both to Nasrin and her family and to the Iranian American community by making this film. Because that's raised Nasrin's visibility, that's raised the human rights story in Iran. People refer to Nasrin as Iran's Mandela. And if you sort of pay attention to the Iran story in America, it's always been the nuclear story. You know, these horrible Iranians, they're out to destroy the world and they're so far from getting a nuclear weapon and so on. And people forget that in fact, there's another Iran. There's a woman like Nasrin who stands for the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, who's received the keys to Florence while being in Karchak prison in the middle of nowhere. So I think we're at this moment of extraordinary globalism. And I think that for me as an activist, the beauty of the gift that Nasrin has given us is, you know, her courage and grace going on a 46-day hunger strike to raise the profile of political prisoners who are exposed to COVID. I mean, 46 days of hunger strike. I mean, you know, Jeff, Marcia, and I, myself, we were, every single day was tense because we didn't know if she's, you know, how long she had, you know, how long, you know, Bobby Sands and people, once the Irish hunger strikers, once they hit the 60-day mark, they started, you know, you die. So to have someone like Nasrin, whose commitment to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights to Iran's political prisoners is so deep, is a privilege. To have a film like Jeff and Marcia's is a privilege. To have the Iranian, you know, your center and be able to share this story with you is a privilege. And I think it comes back down to what Jeff was saying, which is that, you know, the connections are phenomenal and they transcend countries. They transcend barriers of country and language and culture. They really do. You know, that's something I experienced with Zahra's Paradise. But in Zahra's Paradise, I had to create a fictional character and speak about a fictional, you know, Iran. Now I have the real Zahra, you know, and the real challenge and the real battle before us. And I honestly think that Nasrin is a crack in the entire structure of Iran's judiciary. And we're not just talking about Nasrin, we're talking about generations of women. So the apartheid metaphor applies, whose rights are, you know, ridiculously amputated. And so to be able to have such a beautiful force aligned the way it is, for me as an activist is the privilege of a lifetime.
One follow-up question, and then I'm going to hand it over to Soumyaa to talk a little bit more about the filmmaking. I was so struck by, in the movie also, how she just has such deep, deep empathy for everybody. And that's a remarkable quality for somebody who has to deal with a judicial system that is so stacked against her, but her clients, and of course, could make one very, very cynical. And I thought that was such a beautiful thing, that we can see this human being who's dealing with this tremendous weight of a system and the pressure of working within that system, who's still so deeply compassionate towards everybody, you know? And I think that's where, for me, this becomes a kind of universal story, and one that doesn't exclusively belong to Iran, although she is Iranian and the situation is embedded in that country. And I wonder if any of you can talk a little bit about how to deal with a human rights situation that is really calling us to think about our own context too, because we just had a summer of protests around Black lives, and not very much has happened to change the narrative about Black people's situation in this country. And in some ways, I'm seeing that this is the question before us is a human rights question. So how do we take a character like that, who is so powerful for our humanity, and also make it be something more than just her story in a place like Iran?
If I could just start by saying that it's not an accusatory film, as Nasrin isn't an accusatory person. We're not standing in an ivory tower, or more accurately, a blood-stained ivory tower, and making aspersions about another culture. I think it's really, really important to realize that if you're calling for human rights in one country, you have to call for human rights in all countries. You have to call for human rights when it's most uncomfortable for yourself. That hard look at someone else should be twice as hard at ourselves. Mm-hmm. And I could go on and on about this country's not just mistakes, but misdeeds. But just to say that that we have a lot to atone for and to make up for. And this part of the intent of this film is to make sure that it's universal, like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And anything we say about someone else should instantly go back to thought about our own responsibility.
You also brought up something, Persis, too, which is that, and Amir brought it up, which is that we so often only know about other countries, through what we read in the newspaper or whatever lens we choose to view it through, depending on, what you read or what you watch. And so, and most Americans certainly know very little about Iran unless they have family there or they're from there. And, I find that personally very troubling. And because it's not a reflection of the people, just like, our leadership, depending on, whatever, doesn't reflect everybody in this country either. But if that's all you see on television, that's what you think all Americans are like. And so for us, it was really important to sort of capture what we call our common humanity, that people are people. I think, as I've often said, one of my favorite moments in the whole film is the moment with Nasrin picking Nima up from school, with his backpack, and she's holding his hand, and you just see, mother to son with her little boy walking home. And that's such a universal moment, that yes, this woman is a powerhouse and one of the greatest strategic minds of our time, but she's a mom, unlike all mothers, picking their kids up from school, spending time with her kids. And that's our common humanity. And I think if people really realize that, and I think it's one of course, always these problems that I see, is people do not relate to the common humanity of others. If they did, we wouldn't be having a lot of these problems. People don't want to see that ultimately we're all alike in so many ways, even in our own country.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's really hard to dislike people when you see their humanity, and cast, doubt and blame and fear upon them. And I just, in a way, kind of want to add to this conversation, because I really thought it was so interesting. And you talked a little bit about how you would kind of do this dance about, the kinds of things you wanted to see covered, and seeing the inside of these art galleries and theaters, and these little intimate kind of spaces where miracles happen. And I was just thinking about, like, because she's a lawyer and she deals with evidence, and she's always sort of making her case. And so much of the film is sort of evidence, in a way, of her journey, and, sort of like people witnessing her actions and her humanity. And I just, anyway, I just wanted to muse on that a little bit about how, you guys were kind of choosing the evidence that you wanted to create in a way, or asking people to participate in, documenting a certain aspect of her life, and that was, beyond the kind of policy-driven ideas that most people would know about her if they did know about her to begin with.
I'd love to throw this to Amir, but let me just start by saying that I was just reading today about a young woman in Iran, 23 years old, who's been in and out of prison as a photographer, as a writer, as a student. And she recently released a letter detailing her torture and abuse in prison, hoping to have that make change in her country. But instead, the Iranian authorities sentenced her to, I think, another year in prison because she outed the conditions in prison. So evidence, is important, and it can also bring risk with it.
Too, we're talking about the choices that, in making the film, and particularly in editing, about, from what we received and the way we wanted to sort of weave and balance your choices that way. You want to talk a little bit about that? Just the choices that, how the balance.
Yeah, I mean, we had different voices, and, you're trying to be true to everybody. You're not trying to shove words in anyone's mouth, but, we wanted to make sure that we covered a sense of history. We wanted to make sure that we were clear of the United States' own complicity in the 53 coup and things like that. But you also wanted to keep flowing as a narrative. I mean, Sahara's Paradise does that so beautifully as well. You have that sort of instant, immediate, personal connection. And that's what makes, the epic history and also the loss so powerful. I put a plug in for your book, Amir.
Thank you. If I can go back to a little bit of what your question, Persis, about the universality of human rights. I think that there's another aspect of it, which is the universality of threats against human rights. And sadly, we see that everywhere, and picking up in a very brutal way. I mean, obviously, we have impeachment hearings going on in America, which are directly about not just abuses of power, but about the way I see them, a kind of mini reign of terror that's beginning to work its way into language, where pretty much it's the same kind of justice that you'd see in Iran, where a leader turns to the crowd and incites them to murder. So it's not as though Iranians have a monopoly on this kind of horror unrolling. I mean, we had our so I think what I want to say is that when you work on a question on a human rights issue like Nasrin's, and you obviously are showing the prison system in Iran, we're not looking at what we can do. What we can take from Jeff and Marcia's film is to ask ourselves the same questions and apply them here. It's like, what is the situation with COVID and prison and the prison system here? What is the situation with visitation rights? Well, a lot of the stuff that we attribute to other countries, and to their sort of, to for instance, Islam or Iran, when you actually start looking at them, apply here. And just to pass the story back to Jeff and Marcia, I mean, they just had Brian Stevenson say something about Nasrin. So Jeff, do you want to talk about that a little bit? The connection?
Sure. Brian Stevenson was the founder of the Equal Justice Initiative and a great champion for prisoners' rights and against the death penalty, and so a strong bond to Nasrin. He, along with Nasrin and another individual, recently received the Right Livelihood Award, which is a really significant international human rights acknowledgement. And we reached out to Bryan Stevenson, who's famously busy, and asked if he would make a statement on behalf of Nasrin. And it's just, when you hear it, it's just, by the way, it's on our website, it's on YouTube. It just melts your heart. It's just so lovely. And the direct connection between these two giants is so personal. But also personal, I don't think this violates anything to say that we got it translated into Farsi. We shared it with Nasrin's husband, Reza. That night he was able to talk to Nasrin on the phone, and he read Bryan Stevenson's message to her in prison. And it went from being this stirring reminder to all of us about how important Nasrin is, to him directly giving her strength and encouragement in a really difficult time. And, you know,
And then we
could just weep, I will tell you.
And if you want, it's on our website, but also the, NasrinFilm.com, and also Ms. Magazine, who's also been another wonderful partner to us for so long. They, through so much of this process in the launch of the film, they also published the statement as well.
Yeah, and you might as well just mention the website, because if people don't see the film, if it doesn't have that reach, if you don't encourage others to see the film, then all the work is for nothing, and Nasrin stays quiet. So we hope you'll go to www.nasrinfilm.com, and there are easy ways to go see the film and get involved, and send us a note and stay in touch as well.
Can I, because he's talking about that, so I just want to say a couple things about that, which we found. I understand that we've got people from all over the world watching the program today. So I want to let you know that for our Canadian friends, it's still playing in movie theaters. Apparently it's not on Amazon there, but you can get it on iTunes and Google Play and Prime. And for our other friends around the world, the international VOD is going to become available on March 8th. In honor of international, in celebration in honor of International Women's Day. So it'll be available then in every other country around the world then too. It's been seen in Iran, by the way, as well. It was broadcast in Iran already.
Oh, how did you manage that?
BBC Persia and Iran Wire licensed it, and it was on in November.
Wow, that's great. I wanted to ask another human rights related question, since we do have a new president, and hopefully we have a new opportunity, I should say. If any of you have any comments about the possibility that human rights will become part of the way that we approach any rapprochement with Iran, especially around the Iran nuclear deal. I know this is always a question. How much human rights can be part of any negotiation to bring people to the table to agree to something like a nuclear deal?
Well, first of all, having ripped up a nuclear deal that was functioning very well and had a lot of protections in it, was an instant way to destroy our credibility and any chance to build some sort of diplomatic relationship with Iran. So re-entering that and honoring that is a way to lead to other agreements as well. I think it's significant that, Amir was talking about the young woman who was one of the leaders of the campaign to allow women to drive in Saudi Arabia, and has been tortured and held in prison, was just released. I think it's interesting that happened under the Biden-Blinken, with Anthony Blinken as Secretary of State. We pulled out of the war in Yemen. We have pulled back on some of our relations with Saudi Arabia. It's clearly a regime that's not going to just carry their luggage like before. And yet at the same time, there's this seeming accommodation for human rights in Saudi Arabia. And so I think having a new administration with new standards, so long as they're consistent, can create new opportunity, and that should definitely include human rights. And it'll benefit the Iranian leadership to support a higher standard of human rights if they realize that the world will pay attention and reward them in some way. Lastly, and America talked about this better than me, there also is this ominous thing, which is in about 3 months there's elections in Iran, and in part because of the behavior of the Trump administration, there's likely going to be a very conservative new government in Iran. So it's going to be a difficult path forward Amir, do you want to comment on that?
So, I think obviously you can't have America going around assassinating people and speaking about human rights at the same time. It's just, you can't be destroying your own democracy and speaking about democracy in another country. So, as an activist, my job is to raise the importance of human rights on in every occasion and at every opportunity. And it's been very interesting to see what the Europe that again, because of Nasrin and because of the way she's been treated, the European Union's High Commissioner, High Representative, Josep Borrell, recently said that, look, we're going into the nuclear deal, but the word, he used this Latin word, which I just latched onto, which is that he said the sine qua non, the precondition for any conversations about the nuclear issue is human rights. And once you give a human rights activist like me that kind of thing, it's like a bone. We won't let go of that. I must say that there's a part of me that's sort of very disappointed with the West as a whole. I think that generally speaking, America and Europe tend to sort of claim the human rights concerns. But when you look, for instance, at France's behavior in relationship to Iran, Total has been, they've really put business before human rights, and always put Total's interests, for example, before those of the, regardless of the human rights situation. I think America's foreign policy towards Iran has largely been determined by Saudi Arabia and Israel. And so their priority has always been Iran's regional conduct. It hasn't been, it's like, don't do anything wrong outside, but it's kind of sends a kind of a bit of a signal that, we don't really care about what you do to the Iranian people. And so, the reality is that, we have Nasrin, and we have the film, and we don't have, we don't have armies, we don't have treasuries, we don't have any of these things, but we do have a kind of a moral foundation. And, Jeff and Marcia, they are not two people, they are two battalions. So, the number of things, the number of events they've organized for Nasrin. Jeff had an op-ed in the Washington Post just a few weeks ago, on the day of Biden's inauguration, or just the day after. And I'm like, yes, like we have our ambassador, we have our, and it was like Biden free Nasrin, Washington Post. So, I think what I want to say is that we as human rights activists don't have the resources and assets of the state, but we do have incredible influence, and we're using it without fear, without shame, without anything. We're just like, we want Nasrin free. And if I see Blinken or whoever, that's the message. And what I think is so important for the Iranian diaspora to understand is that, because of the coup of 53, because of the way history's fed to us, we tend to think of history in terms of, what the great foreign powers decide to do to us or to do to Iran. But the truth is that as a diaspora, we have incredible influence. I mean, look at the influence that Nasrin, one woman, has simply because of her commitment to her principle and her profession. So I think part of the beauty of working with Jeff and Marcia on the film is this discovery of our combined power, our combined collective power, and the ways in which we can support each other. I've done everything I can for the film. Jeff and Marcia have done everything they can for Nasrin. And, when you see that kind of commitment and devotion, you really don't care so much about what Anthony Blinken thinks. because you kind of know what you think and what you want. And you make that the center of it all. And then Marcia gets on it. And then when Marcia's on your side, there's just no, or you, Perseus, so I just want to constantly come back to our power and our principles and our views. And we live in a democracy, so we can exercise our voice.
I'm going to hand the questions over to Soumyaa now, because I know she has some things. And I want to invite the audience. I see one question. We'll get to you, Josephine. But if other people have questions, we'll take those in the next 10 to 15 minutes. So go ahead, Soumyaa.
I was just reflecting, actually, really trying to listen to what Amir particularly was just saying about our collective power. And some of the things I was thinking about was, and I'm not sure if it's Nasrin who says this, but someone says this idea that art defeats tyranny. And despite all her work, that it was really that she looked to art to be the way to influence people. Yeah, that's what it made me think of when you were speaking. I'm so struck by how she is able to function in a system, meaning the things that she's working against are so horrific and abhorrent that it is striking how much compassion and understanding, cultural understanding she has of those she's working with and against in particular. And I just don't know how she does it because it's so angering, what has happened, not just to her, but, to so many others. And so I just wanted to reflect on that being the joy of the film is one of its best qualities. The putting of the little apples on the table for someone to come and visit, the cups of tea, even like for me, the moment in the film that I loved the most is the phone call at the end when it's this beautiful family phone call that's just interrupted by this recording from the prison. But even that just doesn't get in the way of that life continuing on and the joy of the life continuing on, because I was mad. I was, about that. And they joke about it and they keep going. And I think that resilience is something that we as Americans haven't had the experience to understand. And I think sometimes when we're confronting the racism and the discrimination that we're facing in this country, our lack of accountability in certain spaces makes us unable to actually empathize with the different sides so that you can resolve a problem. And so I just wanted to remark on that. It's not a question.
Well, I'm glad you like that sequence. And for those who haven't seen the film yet, towards the end of the film, after Nasrin's been arrested and held in Naveen prison, we feature part of a conversation that she actually had that Reza recorded from prison. And she's talking to her children, she's talking to Reza, but this recording comes in every minute and a half saying, this is an inmate's call from Naveen prison, and then beep, and then and in the middle of all that, and under the worst circumstances, and she's already been in her life in prison, for years earlier, she's asking her son about the video games he's playing and what her daughter's going to eat for dinner. And her daughter, Mariva, says, yeah, why don't we get takeout more, Dad? Why are you cooking? Let's get takeout. And it's just all so human and real. But I think that's what even makes what's happening right now so especially heartbreaking, which is that, they're a real family. She's a real person. She loves her kids and her husband. And not only is she in prison, but the authorities in their thuggishness, they've gone after her daughter. Mariva was sent over to the Evin prison a couple months ago and interrogated for hours because she had supposedly insulted a guard who was being unpleasant to her mother. Imagine a regime doing that. And Reza himself was put in prison for months in an effort to keep him silent. He's on bail now with this threat that if you talk about your wife, you'll go back to prison. Well, no one's going to stop Reza from supporting his wife. And the day that her medical leave was most recently canceled, and she was sent back to Garchak prison, that very morning, they also were informed that all their bank accounts were frozen. So, but they go forward.
For me, she really lives a life of purpose. And that's something that was very important for me also to understand, that when I had an opportunity also to talk to some of her friends who no longer live there, and to really understand, these women are mothers. How do you do this? I'm a mom, do I think that I could do something like this? They could possibly send me to prison by choice. No, I don't think I could. But for Nasrin, she is a person who, she is, as I said, a brilliant, tactician, but she also just sees the bigger picture. She looks at everything in the bigger picture. She's in it for the long run, the big game. And she really believes in what she is doing, both for her children and other people's children and the future children. She's not of any kind of a selfish pursuit. And I think that purpose and that lack of selfishness and that attitude about life is how she keeps going. I don't think you can persevere unless you have that kind of purpose and bigger picture point of view.
That's a real mother's perspective, if you really think about it. She really gives her mothering to everyone to make us all better at what we do. And that's an incredible.
And also just to say, she has a great sense of humor, as does Reza, and there's, honestly, because we've talked to them, and she's just got, they laugh all the time, and they love to tell the stories. And this is a story that he told us the other day, that he recently, when he was visiting her at Garchak, and he was embracing her, and everyone was like looking at him going, what, you're hugging your wife, you're embracing your wife? Like, we never see this here. This is like so strange to all of the guards and the people there. Well, it turns out that, Garchak is a place where women who've killed their husbands are being held. So it may not be that people will go there and want to, see their spouse, and it's interesting. And, people come to her for legal advice, but they'll tell you these stories, and always the laughter, and even in the spite of all the difficulties, she was so cute when we did some, I can't remember what was on, but she was home, she'd come home on this earlier thing. Yeah. And of course she came out of prison. She was supposed to deal with her heart. She had to do it on the second visit out because she had gotten COVID in the prison, and then the whole family got COVID. And apparently, we finished something. She was watching us do an interview with something. And then, do you tell the punchline of the story?
Only because I know what you're talking about.
It's a great story.
Yeah. Well, it's just that we were being interviewed by Christiane Amanpour on CNN, which got into Iran. And the second we're off the interview, we get a photograph from Reza, and it's Nasrin standing in front of their TV going like this, thumbs up and smiling. And it's like, wow. Again, I think so often when you read about people, either in the news or in history, it all seems so abstract, or they seem like they're carved out of marble. And it's important to realize that Nasrin and others like her, that's a real person. And right this very second, as you were saying earlier, she's in this horrendous prison. And so it's all very real.
Speaking of real, there's a few questions that I think are germane to this conversation. One of them is from GTA, and she says, gratitude to all for this webinar, and of course, all involved in making Nasrin's documentary. I'm aware that the documentary has her and her family's consent. However, I wonder if this documentary might give an excuse to the Islamic Republic to put more pressure on them. And then the second question, I think, is sort of a good follow-up. It says, It's a powerful and daring film, but what's next? What do you want to happen to us, the audience, as an extension of this film? What is tomorrow like post Nasrin?
Yeah.
I'd rather do the second part than the first part, but I can do both. Or
Okay.
all right. The first part was about the concerns of what it might do to them. No one has encouraged us to pursue the film and the release of the film more than Reza and Nasrin. And Marcia says this many times that she feels that Nasrin really knew that she might be something could happen to her, and this was the way to get her voice out. But more important than that, it's really about so many people like her, and I think Amir would say that.
Well, they also think the blanket, like they feel like
it's a protection.
It's more of a protection for them.
Yeah.
That, you're not, people haven't forgotten about her. People are talking about her. And they have expressed this to us, because
Yeah.
we've always worried about this. It's a very legitimate concern. We have had it every minute. But they feel that actually the film does the opposite. It is protecting them more.
Would you agree with that, Amir?
Totally. I would say that, one of the things that we're seeing in Iran, Gitijan, is that, when the Islamic Republic recently wanted to execute some of the people who participated in the November protests, 4 million people took to Instagram to oppose their execution, and the government backed down. So there's definitely a tug of war going on, between, the state is always punishing people, and we all have the shadow of fear and death cast on us. I mean, that's what, for me, the cranes in the Islamic Republic with kids hanging on them are, that we are all living under the shadow of a death threat. But what is amazing about Nasrin is that, she's living with a 38-year prison sentence and 148 lashes, and she still stands on and defends the principles that she cares about. And oftentimes I found that, Jeff, Marcia, and myself might be actually more cautious than she is, that we're more nervous about things sometimes than she is, or than Reza is. And I think that tells you something about the importance of changing and shifting perceptions and norms. If you go into prison and you go on a 46-day hunger strike, you're not afraid of death. What you're afraid of is kind of a pathetic slavery of everyday life, loss of dignity. And I think the beauty of the film is that it shows how somebody weighs these questions and comes up with her own answer to it. And like Jeff and Marcia and Persis were saying, we might make different choices. My mother might make a different choice, or your mothers might make different choices, but Nasrin has made her choices, and those choices are profoundly important commitments. And for me, again, to say is that we have to bang on our drums. I mean, imagine if Mandela were to wither away in Robben Island without the international community protesting apartheid. So my theory or approach is, the louder the better, and the film is that voice,
So, and also, I mean, we have on the website, we have a petition that is linked to PEN America that Amir has been very involved with, and the film also, because we've done a lot of events like this and impact events, has become part of a global campaign. I mean, everything is about also getting her out. I mean, what do we expect? What do we want? I mean, our goal would be to help her, to bring a lot of attention to her situation and thus others, and that would lead to her freedom. And certainly the film has made its way in front of a lot of well-known political figures in this country who know about her through the film and have been writing about the film. And we hope that will lead. And I believe even, when she gets out, and I think she's going to, she's not going to stop doing what she's doing, because we've seen every time she's come home, she's just done something else, or she's spoken about other people, what their situation is. It's never about herself. It's always about somebody else. So she's going to continue the fight from wherever she is to achieve the goals that she set out. And our goal really, as right now, especially, we just want her home permanently, and so she can do what she is, continue on the choices that she wants to make.
And again, going back to that point, which you're just touching on, which is what next? Next is if Nasrin and all the people you see in the film, some who you will only see their face in passing, but they're on the streets of Tehran protesting, or they're agreeing to be in this film, they're putting themselves at risk, or they're women who are standing on a street corner taking off the hijab and waving it on a stick to protest Iran's hijab laws. If they can put themselves at risk for democracy and human rights and a better society in that country, for goodness sakes, we can get off our duffs and do something here. And that's how it lives on. Nasrin, if you look at her office, and I've looked at it 1,000 times from every angle, it's scattered with quotations, inspirational quotations, especially from like Gandhi. She took inspiration from Gandhi and Nelson Mandela and others who tread a very difficult path, but kept going, and by their example, they inspired others, and they made massive change. It's not just being inspired, that makes change. And so, you can get involved in any of the groups that are linked in our website, Amnesty International, PEN America. You can sign the petition. You can start reading about the true history of these two countries, so we're not just wrapped in ignorance. And the thing that Nasrin and Reza and others like them would always say, and Amir Soltani would always say, is, you can make a difference. It's not just this abstract thing. When you get involved, and you say you support your representative who's wavering on dealing with Iran in the right way, that all makes a difference. And that's what we have to do.
And the other thing too, some of you have seen the film and others will be seeing the film. So we just urge you also to share about the film on your social media platforms and encourage everybody and your family members also to watch the film. The dialogue is very important, as you know, and Reza hears from people all the time, by the way, who've seen the film, and it just means so much to them. It gives them a boost, it gives them a lift. So, the goal is to really have lots and lots of people see the film, and that can only happen if people share about it.
Yeah.
Great. I wonder if you could sort of circle back to a topic that we talked about, and I would love to ask the filmmakers and others on the panel if they can talk about how working or seeing this film has opened or influenced how we think about incarceration in the US and trying minors as adults, for example.
Well, first of all, thanks for being part of this conversation, and thanks for the very good question. And you're right. This country has a horrendous history of incarcerating people inequitably, and that was made worse in the past administration, but it's something that's actually shared by both parties in this country. I know that there's plans in this administration to re-examine how people are sentenced, but it's pervasive and it's corrupt too. In my previous job, I did a lot of work in prisons, and they're brutal places, but you also see a commercialization of prisons in the United States that's really distressing. So it becomes this profit motive to keep people locked up and to keep them locked up at the lowest common price. It goes back to the thing we were saying before, that the lessons we learn from other countries have to apply to this country. And we have to stop having a huge part of our population unable to participate in society, unable to vote, and locked away. That's not what a real democracy is.
And maybe that would also be important to kind of piggyback on that, on talking about documentary filmmaking as a political act and as a form of activism, because that's sometimes a controversial topic, right? And you said earlier that your film is not an accusatory film, and I would agree with that. But it does have a point of view. And it has it has a perspective, and it's not trying to be neutral in any way, which is one of the reasons I really appreciate it. And so maybe you could talk a little bit about that, being filmmakers and activists sort of at the same time. And Amir, you too.
I was
You're
just smiling
guilty
at this one.
also.
I was just smiling at this one moment from Nasrin because we're talking about how understanding and forgiving she can be. But there's this one moment, as you might remember, right after the, when she gets out of prison the first time in 2013, her license to practice law is denied, and she enters this 8-month protest where she's standing on the steps of the Iran Bar Association demanding her law license get back, and she's joined by dozens and dozens of people. It's this amazing sequence. And at the end of it in the film, she says, privately, a lot of judges will say to us, "Oh, I'm sympathetic to what you're doing, and I don't approve these laws, but I have to do what I have to do because I'm a judge, and that's the way it is." And my mind right now goes to like the impeachment hearings and all these, senators who will privately say to their Democratic colleagues, "Oh, I understand how egregious Donald Trump was, but I have to vote this way." And I love the fact that Nasrin, in her steeliest moment, says, "And when should we forgive these judges? Never." And she's right. So as far as being an activist is concerned, as filmmakers, we want to be storytellers, but I think the best way to move people is through good storytelling. And you can just apply that in every aspect of your life.
Yeah, I would say that we don't start out, I go, oh, what's this political story we can tell? We don't really think that way. I mean, all of our films have a lot of political elements to them because those are the kind of humans we're drawn to. But I think, from my background as a casting director and Jeff's, too, I mean, our backgrounds are in narrative, really. And Jeff as a writer, especially. And I think we look for, first of all, compelling characters. And Nasrin is obviously a compelling character. There are other activists, but there's something about her, and it's the same thing. I mean, why is she, a star? People always ask me, well, why is someone a movie star? And I would, is it because they're such a great actor, the good breaks? But, there's also, you have to be a compelling character. You don't rise above everything else to the attention of people without having something in your own being very compelling, bigger than actually what you're actually doing. And she has that. But also for us, narrative is really important. We do want to tell the story. We talk a lot about that when we're making our film. The story, what's the story? Who are the characters? What's the bigger story, the smaller story? What do we want people to feel? What do we want people to know? And especially, what do we want people to feel? And how do we want to keep people engaged in the actual story we're telling? And I think then because it's about these people, there's a political element. But our first thought is, how do we tell a good narrative story that will hold people's interest with a compelling character?
I would add, not that you can add to what Marcia and Jeff say, but I'm being Persian, but what I would
Yes,
say,
yes, you can.
What I would say is that, I don't see, and I'm wearing my documentary film hat, it's that obviously when you choose a story, there's a certain part of you that's valuing something. But I think that when you think of film as a process, it really it does come down to a measure of your commitments and your community, both in making it and then in sharing it. So if we don't think of film as just in terms of a product, but as a process, then filmmaking and community building are very much connected. So for instance, the fact that Jeff, myself, and Persis and Soumyaa were all together, this and your audience on the other end, we are Nasrin's community, and we're gathered around this particular story, which happens to be a story that can give life, really, to millions of other women, not just in Iran, but in the Middle East. So the story itself has, of course, I mean, Christianity, Judaism, all these things are religion. All these religions are just stories also. And stories conduct energy. I mean, they conduct energy and they give life. I mean, and I think that, when I think that, can you imagine us not knowing Mandela's story? Can you imagine us not knowing Nasrin's story? And can you imagine how many thousands of stories we really don't know that should be told and must be told? So obviously another part of it all is money. And if you're doing the right story, it somehow comes, you know, it finds its way to you one way or another, and then it sustains itself. So yeah, I'm all for thinking of film in terms of community.
Can I add to that, Amir? Because part of our conversation is about filmmaking, not just Nasrin. And so, I worked, when I first got into doing documentaries, I worked for a couple of companies that just treated people terribly. And I remember I worked on this terrible show that was about disasters and stuff like that. You're trying to have a job and get your kids to school and stuff. But the people I was working for, just like, they would get footage from someone who just lost their farm and they would never pay them because they figured that, oh, they'll never be able to complain about it. And it's just so distressing. Marcia as a producer of this documentary, is the one who oversees the books and makes sure everyone gets paid. And I have to say, I'm not just complimenting Marcia because she's my partner and we're married, but I think there's something sort of that even reflects Nasrin's character in the way you can do a project. And so Marcia is like the master of sincerely writing thank you notes to everybody, to making sure everyone gets paid properly on time, to make sure everyone gets credit, to really worrying that the process behind the film is humane and reflects the values that we want to reflect. And by the way, when she was at the top level of like the Walt Disney Company, she treated people the same way, which is why years later, when she's not there, they'll still answer her calls. And so whatever you do, I think those standards that you apply to others is part of the joy of it. And also, it's like, it doesn't do any good to make a film about some noble subject if you treat people badly. So, if Marcia ever writes a book about producing, it should be producing with humanity.
Well, and respect for other people's contribution. We talked about this earlier. Launching a film is very difficult, and I think one of the most important things you can possibly do is finish your film for your community of people that supported you. And I've always felt, whether somebody gives you $25 or $2,500 or $25,000, it doesn't matter. I mean, I care about all those people. I don't care about, because I want those people to know that their participation, meant a lot to us, and that we finished this film and this film's out there, because of their participation. I think that for me is a hugely driving force and an incredible burden at times, because it creates a huge anxiety, in terms of getting these films out into the world and, birthing your film and raising your film like a child that you give birth to. I feel that way about them, but it's something I feel so strongly about.
Again, building on what Marcia's saying, I think one of the interesting things about making a film or finishing a film is learning how to listen to your film. Because when I was making Dogtown, there were many times where I was sick and tired of myself and the characters and the film and the whole thing. I wanted, there were times where you just want to push the emergency brakes on a film and stop it, and it will refuse to stop because the story is not done. So there's this sort of mystical, I think, I don't know what Jeff and Marcia think, but there's this sort of mystical rapport you have with your film where you don't always know when it's finished, but when it really finally is, then it really does let you know that it's done.
Except it's not finished. I mean, I saw Dogtown before I knew you, years before I knew you. And most things just sort of go into this wastebasket in my brain, and but I can still see the characters in that film and the way they walked the streets and the life they lived, because you brought them to life. And I would suspect because they were living a hard life, many of them are gone now, but they live on, And so that's an amazing thing too. They're preserved in this amber, and they live on. And so that's a gift you gave to them, and then you give to us.
Because you have a number of people who study documentary filmmaking that we're talking to today. And, unlike narrative film in a way, and I've worked on, believe me, hundreds of films and episodes of television, for close to 40 years. And most of it, it has its moment and it's out there and it's gone. People watch it and it's gone. It's over. It succeeded or it didn't succeed. Now, granted, pretty much everything lives now on the internet, but for the most part, everything has its moment in the sun and you move on. There are very few movies that people, really stick around as kind of legendary movies that everyone has to see in every, the Godfather sort of experience.
Clueless.
No, well, Clueless, yeah. Well, that does happen to me with that film. But with documentaries, they're kind of evergreen thing. The stories never go away. I mean, documentaries have a life for people much longer, than narrative films do, because the subject matter, or the subjects, can remain important storytelling, and education and information. I always felt with documentaries, I've always loved docs because no matter even good or bad or in the middle, I always learn something from every film that I saw as a documentary. They teach me something about something I didn't know about. And, because they have this other value that allows them to have, as Jeff was saying, kind of this timeless quality in which you can continue watching them from years to come and find it in a library. And we do hope we have a wonderful, the Collective Eye is our educational distributor. And this film is in libraries and in college and university libraries. And, people are not going to stop writing stories about Iran, maybe about Nasrin, about the women's movement in Iran, about the prison system in Iran, about, what the politics of Iran. And the film will be in libraries, and people will find it again and look at it to maybe use part of it for their research papers. And that's what you can do with a documentary.
Amir, you want to answer? There were a couple questions, and it looks like you're gonna. People are giving you praise, Marcia and Jeff, especially. Thank you for your good work. And one question I think that Amir, you might want to answer, since you said you were going to answer it, is what would Nasrin want us to do to help, besides raising awareness as this film is doing, the people she cannot help now because she is in prison?
It's a great question, and I think Jeff answered it. When Nasrin was just about to get her Right Livelihood Award, she was summoned back to prison, and we spoke over the phone. And this was the Swedish foreign minister was about to introduce her, and it was a big deal. And I was kind of just, when Soumyaa was talking about lack of resilience, when I heard she's going back into prison, I felt I just collapsed in an abyss. And she was kind of holding my hand and saying, no, you'll be fine, kind of, And, but what she said was, at the time, there was a dual Iranian Swedish citizen who had been taken back and forth to be executed. And she just bluntly and clearly said, look, I don't care. I'm not interested in anything that you have to say about me. Make sure that Right Livelihood folks use their platform to highlight the situation of this Iranian Swede who's about to be executed. And we passed that message on, and that's what the Right Livelihood people did. And that person has not been executed. So I think that if you take that as a principle, Nasrin would want you to find a person who is in a fragile legal or political situation, and raise the visibility of their case to the best of your ability. I mean, she wouldn't want you to necessarily go around saying, Nasrin, because not that it's not necessary, but there are a lot of women, and this is the sort of tragic part that she's often spoken about. There are a lot of women, who are not, if I can use this term, who are not, they're just not known. They're in prison for really much smaller reasons that are equally tragic, and they get very little attention. They get very little attention here. I just saw a doc that was a short doc for the Oscars where it shows people leaving the LA jail. I think 20, 30, I don't know how many people leave every day. And they stand in this bus station with $100. This is after 20, 30 years in prison, and some of them just have nowhere to go. I'm just stuck. So, I mean, we need personal engagement, we need political engagement, we need systemic change, and it can happen at any and all of these levels, because people are really, I mean, I think our entire concept of justice that revolves around incarceration needs to be looked at from the ground up. When Nasrin is sentenced to 38 years in prison, I can't get this out of my head. There's a scene in the movie with Nima, her son, who's tiny little twerp, standing in front of the prison, in the visiting room, with a sheet of glass between them, and he's holding his lollipop. And it's just hard not to think that, 38-year prison sentence, which is given to a mother, when she has a 4 or 5-year-old kid, is actually a sentence against that child as well. That's just the brutality of it. Or, you put a father in a prison in America. I mean, just add up the number of years that time that millions of people around the world are in prison for. It will come to like hundreds of millions of hours. And that's millions of hours that children don't have their parents, that families are broken. So, what I would say is that if you engage at the personal level with a single issue, a single person, that single person can let you see the structures, the systems, all of that stuff. And you build your knowledge and you build your empathy and you raise your game. I mean, that's what you do. And that's why I'm so, incredibly grateful to Jeff and Marcia for, because, not only because of the film they've made, but because of the way they raise the game. You take Nasrin's story to the Washington Post, you're making a big difference. You take Nasrin's story to Right Livelihood, and the Swedish foreign minister introduces her. You're making a big difference. You take Nasrin's story to the European Parliament, as Jeff and Marcia have done, and then the European Parliament comes with a major human rights statement that's the most extraordinary thing we've had in 30, 40 years. You're making a difference. And that's where I think the meaning and purpose comes from.
Thank
We
you
have-
so much, Amir, about making that point, which really I think applies to our American prison system, that you can't really punish one person. That every person that you punish, there's a whole community of people that also gets punished with them. And I just wanted to highlight that point, because that really drives home what's wrong with that structure and that system, not just in our country, but all over the world.
We have about 5 more minutes before we have to close this out, but I wanted to see if there was any additional questions from the audience or anything. I want to put a plug in for the film again. It's in the chat, www.nasrinfilm.com. And also there's a petition. And I think the other part of this is that it opens a window into thinking more complexly about Iran, just to think about, like, when you care about a person, you care about the country and the culture from which she springs. And I want to thank you especially for that, because I think doing the work that I do on behalf of the center, I'm so struck by the importance of telling a different kind of story. And last year when, Trump called for the assassination and actually executed Soleimani, it was a moment where I was like, oh, here we go again. We're going backwards in time. And many of us who, have family and have lived with the shadow of the hostage crisis and the 40 years of policies towards Iran, we need to have a different kind of narrative put in front of the American people. So when you tell the story about somebody who's courageous and compassionate and resilient in the face of, the abuses of of a government, and still, like Shireen Ebadi, doesn't want to see their country attacked through war, but wants to change things from within. I think that's an exceedingly important message that you're conveying about this film, is that, as you said, it's not accusatory, but it's also not condemnatory.
Persis, can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
What do you think the future holds for Iran? Do you have hope for change?
I don't think we have any choice but to feel hope. I think that I don't, much like some of the comments in the chat, it's hard to imagine how to change things when you're standing where we are. But if we don't try, we won't ever get close to it. I guess I believe that it's much like what Amir was saying, is that, can you imagine the world without Nelson Mandela? No. Can you imagine the story without somebody like Nasrin, who's willing to tell a different story, that this isn't the Iran she wants to live in? I think that that's kind of, to me, that's the eternal vision of hope, is that you look in the face of this darkness and say, there's got to be something else. So, I'm much like you, I have the desire to go to Iran and be close to people there, but I have some of the same limitations you do,
Let me just make one more connection, because we've talked about Mandela, we've talked about Mahatma Gandhi, but Marcia and I have had the chance to meet and work with the great John Lewis on several occasions, the civil rights leader, and he very much reminds me of Nasrin. And maybe a thought to leave on is, one of the things I loved about John Lewis is that John Lewis came out of the civil rights movement, and he came to realize that his struggle for rights was a universal struggle, and that if he was fighting for the rights of Black Americans, that also gave him a kinship, a connection to women's rights, to LGBTQ rights, that we're all in the same boat together. And I love that about him, to see that you see beyond yourself to the commonality with others. And we can certainly see that with Nasrin. Here she is, this Muslim woman, as Marcia was mentioning, but fighting for Zoroastrians and Baha'is and Kurds, and stepping outside of herself and seeing we have this shared need for rights, whoever we are. And so that's something we can apply in our own lives. And I hope that, and how lovely it is that Nasrin's far away and she's in prison now, but at this very moment she can inspire us. And so I hope that she can inspire us to sort of crack open that door inside ourselves and to let others in.
Thank you. Yeah, and I want to, my colleague wrote that it's a great project. Thank you so much for becoming a noble voice for the people of Iran and using your art to raise consciousness about human rights. So thank you. And I also want to say that we have a trailer, so I hope you two and Amir will look at our trailer, The Dawn is Too Far.
Fabulous.
And we really, really applaud you. It's a tall order for people to make a film in COVID, but it's an even taller order to make a film the way you've done. So thank you.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you. So is the trailer online, or are you going to send it to us?
It's on Vimeo, called The Dawn is Too Far, but we'll send it to you
for sure. Yeah, we'll send
Yeah.
it to you.
And we're excited about it because it also tells a different kind of story, and one that's more local, of course, but also about the struggles of Iranians and the traumas that they have lived through, So I want to sort of conclude by just thanking all three of you for joining us, Amir, Marcia, Jeff, and we wish you continued success with getting the message out with your beautiful film, and thank you for your excellent work.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for having us, and it was a wonderful program today. We really appreciate great questions and, touching upon so many important things. So thank you.
And please give our warmest regards to Nasrin and her family the next time you speak to her, and that there are lots of people rooting for them.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Have a wonderful night. And thanks to everyone here.
Bye.
Good night.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.